Hi, Radhika, are you here? Oh, great. We're at time, and I think everybody is in the room. Can I just get a go ahead from the APrIGF team?
Yes, please get started and we'll get the recording started as well.
Super. Thank you so much. Hello
Recording
and welcome,
in
everyone.
progress.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Namrata Maheshwari. I'm Asia Pacific Policy Counsel at Access Now, and I also coordinate the global team's work on encryption. I'll be your moderator today, and in addition to the stellar panelists, I also hope to hear from as many of you as possible. As I'm sure you know, there has been a fascinating and concerning debate over the last few years, especially over the last few months, on the use of encryption, particularly end-to-end encryption on communications platforms. While there is no agreed upon legal definition of end-to-end encryption, it is broadly understood as a tool that ensures that the content of messages can be accessed only by the sender and the recipient. No third party can access this content, not even the service provider itself. The debate on end-to-end encryption is typically centered around the need for encryption to ensure privacy and security, and increasing demands by governments and law enforcement to create weaknesses or exceptional access mechanisms. These calls to regulate content on such platforms are typically to prevent disinformation or fake news or misinformation, child sexual abuse material, or other types of illegal content. The justification has actually been a shifting goalpost. These calls often come in the form of international joint statements, such as those issued by the Five Eyes Alliance, and sometimes in the form of domestic laws and policies as well. Some examples of such laws include the Assistance and Access Act, or TOLA as it is known in Australia, which creates something called a technical capability notice, which means that government agencies would require communication platforms intermediaries to develop the ability to decrypt content. There's also the IT rules in India, which came into effect in May of this year, which have been challenged before various courts, including by sflc.in, and we'll be hearing from the team there as well. They require significant social media intermediaries, which are those with more than 50 lakh or 5 million users, to develop the ability to trace the originator of information on a platform. This would undermine end-to-end encryption. The effects of these laws extend far beyond the boundaries of the territories within which they operate, and their impact on rights and freedoms have often been called into question. The goal here is to have you hear from experts working on encryption in the Asia-Pacific region and globally. With that, I have the privilege of introducing the panelists. Mishi Chaudhary is a technology lawyer with law practice in New York. She is the legal director at the Software Freedom Law Center and founder of India-based sflc.in. Hannah Bozkor is press officer at Tuta Nota. You must correct us if we're pronouncing that incorrectly, Hannah. The secure email service that automatically encrypts all data. She has been with the company since it launched 7 years ago. Next, we have Jeremy Malcolm, who is the executive director of Prostasia Foundation, a child protection nonprofit. Prior to that, he was senior global policy analyst at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And finally, we have Rajneesh Singh, who is regional vice president for the Asia Pacific at the Internet Society, a nonprofit organization dedicated to ensuring the open development, evolution, and use of the internet worldwide. With that, a very quick introduction on the flow. We'll have you hear from the panelists for about 5 to 7 minutes each, after which we will open up the floor for questions. So please jump in. We'd love to hear from you. And with that, Mishi, I'll hand over the mic to you.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to speak on everything. So then all of the other panelists are just repeating. Usually that happens with the last panelist, but thank you. I didn't expect it to be the first one. Thank you for organizing this panel as well as APrIGF. It's very good to be with all of you, old friends and new. Rajneesh, who's been so instrumental in doing this. Jeremy's been at it for a long time, and Namrata. a much younger but much smarter than all of us entrant. Hannah, I'm very glad to be here so that we get to know each other. I think you summarized it pretty well. From my perspective, it is here we go again. As a lawyer who has worked in the US a lot on encryption right from the get-go for free and open source software projects and studied the history, I feel that over the last 30 years, national governments have repeatedly proposed fatally defective digital encryption policies. The same ones, time and again. They learn nothing, they forget everything, and it seems that appears to have been the motto. And now, hardly for the first time, the government of India has begun another cycle in which our organization, SFLC.in, is pretty active. I think because we also see the expanding array of end-to-end encrypted services, which are available now to the general public as well in terms of messaging, there seems to be a convenient amnesia thinking as if encryption only is available where WhatsApp or a Signal exists or such private messaging services exist, forgetting that the financial services as well as e-commerce would not exist without something as basic as what we understand. Namrata already said that the definition is not perhaps accepted in one way or the other, but we do understand some bits of it. In terms of that the recipient and the sender are the only two people who perhaps have access, not even the intermediary can have access to the content of that data. But we also see whenever there is going to be an end-to-end encrypted services available to the general public, the law enforcement concerns about going dark will return to the forefront of the policy debates around the world. And to my mind, a new angle on these policies has been this content moderation, to tie and make a connection between what kind of content which is there available. Mostly it starts with child sexual abuse material and terrorist content, because that seems like universally accepted. Who's going to ever object to it? And because we are doing such a great job about only addressing those issues, the debate is presented in a way that if you oppose any of these policies, you are perhaps in favor of CSAM or in favor of terrorist content. Again, when it becomes a political debate or it comes from the law enforcement, it helps them to destroy that nuance in the discussion. And to present it as security versus privacy, I thought that we would have moved much further from it, but we keep repeating the same cycle and it's always represented that way. But now, because a lot of these intermediary companies who either started as social media companies have also expanded, and in their businesses, such messaging services exist and they're much bigger, we see that the content moderation part is being stressed much more than the usual methods. Now, digital encryption infrastructure holds the commercial and financial internets together. Without the same encryption algorithm, sometimes, and sometimes obviously different ones, but common facilities, we cannot provide secure communications protocols for the financial markets, or secure e-commerce, or afford individual private means of researching, cogitating and communicating with one another across the world. And when governments propose to make these individual short messages traceable, that's the new favorite word for everybody, or to limit the use of industrial strength encryption by individuals emailing one another, or whatever other interventions in privacy are said to be necessary for law enforcement or security of the state, their technical and legal weaponry winds up threatening to destroy the security of the financial markets and the basic instruments of e-commerce on which national economic growth and social development depend. So policy moves not progressively towards a safer and a more private digital society, but it moves in a destructive cycle of recurrent amnesia in which bad ideas are resurrected only to die again of the conflict between what SFLC in its new report is calling it political mythology and technical reality. There's always this myth presented politically, we can get it done, which does not really match the technical reality, because the consensus among several cybersecurity experts is clear that there's no way to provide third-party access to end-to-end encrypted communications without also creating the backdoors and vulnerabilities that can be exploited by anyone that finds them. Maybe we all will die fighting this battle because it's the same thing, or with no matter which jurisdiction you are in. But I think it just keeps happening. There's no way for only law enforcement to have access to backdoors without risking the bad actors from gaining access to them. And it weakens the security of the whole system. So SFLC, because India, in its smartness, came up with something called a traceability provision as part of the new intermediary liability rules, which is a kitchen sink of everything. These are called Information Technology Intermediary Guidelines rules, notified in February of 2021. But one of the major provisions is Rule 4 Clause 2. Thankfully, it was first challenged by us as representative of free and open source software developers in the Kerala High Court, because Signal is just a non-profit of free and open source software developers. It's not a company like WhatsApp or something bigger, or Matrix, etc. And we did this, and now Facebook and WhatsApp have also challenged it in one of the federal high courts. So we are watching. But all I will say is backdoors aren't possible. Same debate over and over again. But we must push that this is not just about you and me securely having conversations, but it's about the security of the net.
Thank you so much, Mishi. I think that was full of quotable quotes, and I think it really lays the foundation really well, both about recurrent amnesia, about fatally defective encryption policies. You're right that the government is narrowing the debate in terms of what is the area of companies that are affected and what are the reasons they are doing it, but actually we need to look much wider, otherwise we'll help them destroy the nuance. Thanks, Mishi. With that, Raj, may I invite you to make some opening remarks, please?
Sure, thanks. Thanks for this opportunity, and it's good to be amongst old friends. Mishi, I haven't seen you for a long, long time. And of course, hopefully some new friends, and the young, as Mishi pointed out, and much smarter than Mishi and I hope. So perhaps this will be the last time I ever speak on encryption. I think it's time to hand the baton on to other people, I fear. Now, as Mishi suggested that she would talk about everything, so therefore I have nothing much to talk about anymore because she's covered all the bases. However, just a couple of thoughts based on what she has just said, and just some of my personal thoughts on this issue. Unfortunately, I've been involved in this conversation for far too long. Be it today's encryption or the forebearers of that in terms of privacy and data protection and whatnot. So one thing, so Mishi in the comments mentioned the political angle. So one thing that's very clear to me is that so very often what happens is that this encryption thing becomes a nice and convenient, bright, shiny object for governments to aim at. The other observation I have is that, a lot of it is very politically motivated. You will see that the rhetoric tends to increase when political fortunes decline, when elections are around the corner, or when there's a need to deflect attention to something else. Now, unfortunately, my country and the leadership in it is very good at deflection, and of course, we've also become the regulatory sandbox for the world in many ways. I'm talking about Australia here, obviously. There was mention of the Aaa Bill and AA, so I won't get into that. I think that's been flubbed quite a bit in previous discussions, and I'm assuming everyone's aware of that. But the interesting thing, of course, also is that a lot of these discussions, at least from be that government agencies or law enforcement, is trying to shift the onus back onto vendors and service providers. One thing that we are starting to hear very often now is that, no, we don't want to break encryption, but you have to give us that data anyway. So, of course, there was a lot of pushback when these first narratives came in around breaking encryption. And so, the powers that be have been smart as well. So they've tried to change the narrative saying that, no, we don't want to break encryption. We believe in encryption, blah, 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 but we still want access to the data. We still want access to the information stream that's flowing because, bad people are doing bad stuff. There's mention of CSAM and terrorist content, and again, they become topics of convenience as part of the attack. It's no more than that. If you look at child sexual abuse materials and other forms of abuse, they're not new things. They've existed for pretty much ever since human civilization has existed, right, in various ways or forms. Yes, true, perhaps it makes it a bit easier these days to access that, or the internet helps amplify it. But the fact remains, it's a social issue. It's not a technology issue, right? You have to, again, I keep on going back to that, it becomes a matter of convenience to say, no, it's because of the dark web or the encrypted web or whatever else that these problems are increasing. They're not. It's a social and behavioral issue that needs to be addressed first. The other thing very quickly I just want to mention is, I don't think there's enough attention being paid to the economic impact of what these measures end up doing. Now, here in Australia, we had a couple of companies come out and say that, there is a reputational damage attached to it. One company, I read a report that said, they could not enter a foreign market because there's a cloud that exists around, or questions that exist, does this Australian company actually safeguard our security and privacy, or will the government have a back door into their things? Because the other problem that we have here in Australia with the TC and the technical capability notices and all that is, no one actually knows whether one's been served and what action was taken. So there's so much secrecy around the whole process that, that even worsens the reputational damage that is possible on companies operating in this space. Mishi mentioned a little bit about finance and the financial markets, and they are not part of this conversation, which I always find quite interesting, because of all things, the financial systems of the world should be the most concerned about breaking encryption. Having said that, of course, the stock market's been going down over the last few days, so that's not very nice. But the fact is, if you don't have that security and privacy in your transactions, be it banking or the stock markets or whatever else, how can you ensure that you have trust in the system? So that's a major blow to the trust equation, in my opinion. And I really think we need to get people from the finance industry heavily involved in this conversation, because it probably affects them more than anyone else. They don't realize it at this moment. So I'll leave it at that. I think I've sort of rambled on a couple of things, and I look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists and see where this discussion heads. Thank you, Namrata.
Thanks so much, Raj. Super insightful comments, and there's so much for policy advocates also to learn from, in terms of why parts of this debate keep repeating themselves over the crypto wars version 1.0 and 2.0, and yet we're seeing more and more kind of sophisticated attacks against encryption. And I do think, like you said, part of the fight against it will be to kind of deepen the range of our ammunition and get other kinds of companies, including companies from the financial sector, to become more vocal about how it impacts them. Thanks so much. With that, I'd like to invite somebody from the private sector. Hannah, would you like to step in, please?
Yes, sure. Thank you very much for letting me talk here as well. This is a very important topic, particularly to us. As you know, Tutanota is an encrypted email service. So should the government, for us it's Germany, but it's the same discussion we have here, should the government decide on forcing companies to implement backdoors, this would directly affect our business, but not just our business. We have, what we have to see is that we have a lot of customers, let's say lawyers and doctors, who need encrypted communication with their clients, with their patients. In Germany, it's even required by law that lawyers encrypt their communication with their clients. If they didn't, they would go back to the 20th century, and they would have to, well, what many lawyers here in Germany still do, they have to write letters again. And yeah, this would just throw us back in history. And I think this can't be the right way to approach a situation where we have a technology, we have a great technology that gives us the power to communicate confidentially online. And of course, we have to make sure that this technology is not being abused, but just because it is being abused, we can't just outlaw the technology. This is a step back. This is not how we have to go forward as a society. And that's where this debate comes in, and that's why I'm very happy that you invited me to join in here, because it is important to raise the attention for this. And also, as others said, governments usually use CSAM and terrorism just as a means to swing the public opinion, to tell the public, you know, here it is better to stop encryption because it is so dangerous. But no, it is not the encryption that is dangerous. What is also often ignored in this discussion is that encryption and privacy is very much needed in a democratic society, in the democratic process. In Germany, privacy is a basic human right. And this is out of our experience. We've had the Eastern Germany, where we had a very strict government, where we had a lot of surveillance, and we know how this affects a society. And this is really something that we would never ever want to live through again. So this is a very important part that we need to keep in mind, that privacy is there for the society, for the citizens, not for the criminals. But we can't take it away from everyone just because a few are abusing it. And yeah, that's the point I want to make today. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Hannah. And what you said reminds me of something that we have heard and we read often, right? When you outlaw encryption, only outlaws will have encryption. So I think a trend is that encryption is often used as a scapegoat for other issues that are more pressing. And like Raj mentioned, like all of you pointed out, CSAM, et cetera, are primarily not technological problems. So to use encryption as a scapegoat is a mistake, and it's going to be a big problem long term, not just for users, but the markets and from so many other angles. With that, Jeremy, may I invite you to please share your 2 cents? Thank you.
Thank you. I thought I would talk about something a bit more specific that's happening right now. So I'm going to talk about Australia's Online Safety Act and an upcoming regulation under that act that would affect the availability of encrypted internet services in Australia. So the Online Safety Act was passed in June 2021, and it's the first law of its kind in a global push towards a new approach towards online safety that national child safety groups are promoting. Other examples of this approach include the Online Safety Bill in the UK, Canada's Harmful Content Proposal, and the Earn It Act in the United States. And the most notable feature of these laws and proposals is that they seek to make internet platforms responsible not only for illegal content, but also for content or activities that are harmful. The Australian Online Safety Act does this by setting a series of basic online safety expectations, or BOSEs, that internet platforms are expected to comply with. For example, these include expectations that what Australia regards as extreme pornographic content will not be made available at all, and that regular pornographic content will be hidden from children. And these expectations can be enforced by an order from the Online Safety Commissioner requiring content to be deleted, links to be removed from search engines, and apps to be removed from app stores, all of which has to happen within a 24-hour timeframe. Now, the Online Safety Act also allows the Minister to define additional BOSEs by regulation, and the first such regulation is currently undergoing a public consultation process until October 15. It's this regulation which requires platforms to eliminate content that may be illegal or harmful, although the word harmful is not defined, and also includes a BOSE about encrypted services. These aren't enforceable in the same way as the content-related BOSEs, but the Commissioner can publicise a platform that fails to meet the expectation. So the BOSE on encrypted services provides, if the service uses encryption, the provider of the service will take reasonable steps to develop and implement processes to detect and address material or activity on the service that is or may be unlawful or harmful. The reality is that there's going to be no way for providers to comply with this. Consider Apple's iOS spyware proposal. Even if Apple had fully implemented this proposal, it still would not have been in compliance with this BOSE. That's because Apple's technology was only designed to detect known illegal images from a set of image hashes on its encrypted service. The Australian BOSE would require platforms to detect material that may be unlawful, in other words, previously unknown images, or material that may be harmful, whatever that means, or activity that may be illegal or harmful. There's simply no feasible way for platforms to do that. So how will platforms comply with this encrypted services BOSE? First, they may simply drop support for encryption, which will give them a better, though still not a good chance of being able to detect material or activities that are illegal or harmful, or that may be illegal or harmful. Second, if they simply choose to remain non-compliant with the BOSE because it's impossible to comply, then the Commissioner can name and shame them as being unsafe. And this will create unnecessary public resistance to the use of these encrypted platforms. So we also need to consider the possibility that although there aren't compliance, there isn't a mechanism to force compliance yet, enforcement measures may be added to the law in the future. So this is not really the right approach to take to this problem. The right to anonymity and encryption is part and parcel of the human right to privacy. We need to invest more in solutions to abusive behaviour online that aren't just about circumventing the security of private communications. Unlike other countries such as Germany and Canada, Australia has no government-funded program to intervene to prevent people who are sexually interested in children from abusing in the first place. And as Raj said in his presentation, this is a social problem. It's not a technological problem. So that's really where Australia should be directing its attention if it wants to make progress on this issue. Let's treat it as a social problem and put the necessary resources in to stop abuse from happening in the first place, rather than, as you've said, using encryption as a scapegoat. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. I think you're right in that a lot of the policies we're saying are short-sighted. They create requirements, they impose mandates without really considering what following through with them would require. Like you mentioned, that even Apple's proposal would not really comply with the Australian BOSE. So, and that's something we're seeing from governments in various jurisdictions, including, I know, in India, where the government has imposed a traceability mandate. But the technicalities of it has simply left up to companies. When companies say we cannot really implement it the way you think we can, the government's response is you figure that out. Our job is just to create this requirement, and how you impose it, how you follow through with it is up to you. Mishi, I wanted to come back to you to ask you about what you were referring to towards the end of your opening remarks, SFLC's challenge before the Indian courts against the IT rules. And in general, that, like you mentioned, there are several challenges. So I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about what do you think the role of courts is as far as the trajectory of encryption is concerned in India? And what do you think are the long-term and cross-border implications of what we see kind of panning out in court?
So to answer the question, the role of courts is a little unpredictable right now, mostly because, at least in India, what we've seen is not very encouraging in the past. It is the kind of arbiter which comes from the benches is mostly about, oh, you're such a sophisticated company, why can't you figure a solution out for this problem? And that is pretty discouraging even from the highest courts as well. And the kind of technical submissions which we have seen, which have found the attention of the courts in India from a few IIT professors, are the only things which are being considered. So it's mostly like a balancing act. Oh, there's one in favor of the government and the other is against the government, but neither of those are actually addressing the technical issue which this will all create. But to say that they have no role in play is not going to be correct, because when the legislature is not going to address the issue and the executive has some rules, these rules are obviously subordinate legislation, and they are promulgated by the executive, then in order to challenge them, if one stops having a reasonable conversation with the executive, that's the only organ of the government which is left. So no wonder the fact that we approached one federal court and Facebook and WhatsApp have approached the other one. And there's some other challenges which are also pending, mostly to think that perhaps that's a forum to have a reasonable conversation to explain that this is not just an India thing. What you decide, a lot of people are watching. It's the same thing when Belgium comes with a legislation. The Netherlands is watching very, very closely, and this is something which is happening these days as we talk, and mostly to see, okay, what are the things the other jurisdiction is going to do, what works, what doesn't work, and then can we do a copycat of it? And I think that's a major problem. As much as we understand the world's tech policy, there is one way of doing it in the US way, which is more laissez-faire. There is a way of doing the European Union, which has much more regulatory burdens. I'm not going to talk about the authoritarian Chinese, Iranians, or the Russians one, but then there's another one, which is led by mostly India. India is not just offsetting China, but what happens there is closely watched by other countries in Southeast Asia, many countries in the continent of Africa, plus also Latin America, because of the BRICS alliance. We used to think that Brazil was a leader in a lot of rights in terms of, because they had Marco Civil, etc., but we've seen a decline there. So they currently have a role to play for sure, because that's the only choice that was left. But I do think that public's role in this debate is even bigger, because when the rights between the governments and the companies are being negotiated, the fat cats are making those deals, and they're all negotiating our rights. And as much as the governments ostensibly say that this is for our protection, we all know this is about information management. It's no secret that the weaponization of whether it is social media or even services like WhatsApp by political parties is the major cause of misinformation. If these rules actually ever worked, we would be tracing a lot of this to the political parties and their cells or whatever. And nobody wants to do that, but this is mostly to use it for political purpose, the dissent, etc., which really bothers me quite a bit here. Even in some instances in India, when we have seen simple interrogations by police or even investigations, they have used and seized mostly people's devices and gotten access to such apps and messages from them without having any regard to even rules of evidence or anything else. So that's why I think the larger the public talks about it, that we have an independent seat on the table, you can't rely on the companies will fold. Other than one time when Google decided to exit China, a decision which it has often regretted, we have never seen companies actually come in favor of their users. They will fold because these markets are very attractive. And that's why I personally think that although the debate may be technical in certain aspects, the important part of this entire thing or the development is because this widespread usage of the applications of encryption, when people understand what the principle it means in their lives. You may not understand applied mathematics, but you do understand how it works in terms of when you're going and buying vegetables, just basic math, how it works, or science, how it works, and how that forms the basis of all of it. And I think that's why if the public can understand this is an important right, very tightly entwined with how they express themselves and what, because if you don't have the freedom to think and interact or ask questions, there's not going to be any other right left. That's why the right to privacy is important, because all other rights flow from that. And if I can't talk to my parents, my family, uncomfortable thoughts, or I can't conduct certain kind of things which are now only possible. I think Hannah mentioned, I'm a lawyer myself. In some countries, attorney-client privilege is very, very important and very strongly enforced. In other countries, it's not. And we've watched in India, even mental health therapists talk about film celebrities about their mental health. And there's a problem out there. And that's why it becomes even incumbent for various professions, as well as many aspects of our everyday life, Government of India is issuing a health ID, trying to get everybody's health information without even having a basic Data Protection Act. So that's why I like the debate to be simplified more and the resistance to be much stronger against all of these proposals, and many of the technologists to actually go deeper into examining this and making the government responsible to answer. You tell us, why don't you hire the technologists and tell us how this is going to work?
Thanks, Meshi. A lot of important points there, and one of them I think touches upon why conversations like this are important, right? You spoke about countries enacting problematic laws and then other countries playing copycat. And that is why we need conversations like this, where we can speak to each other's jurisdictions, exchange lessons. One example, in fact, in Southeast Asia is Thailand, where the new intermediary liability law is modeled after India's recent IT rules. And it imposes a mandate to retain data, including on encrypted platforms, for I think it is a very long, up to 2 years or so. So, like I was saying earlier, I agree with you. This effect extends far beyond the territories of what we imagine. And in terms of public vocabulary, there has to be a change, and I think slowly but surely there will be a change. Also, because what we see on television, what we see on hoardings, is an example of what the public is paying attention to, right? And suddenly on these hoardings, at least in India, we're seeing companies use terms like the service is encrypted. So you will have more people at least looking into what encryption means for them, what it means for their banking transactions, what it means for their communications. And I think one of the things people like us, those who care about encryption, have to do is to make sure that that conversation continues. Raj, there was a question for you in the chat, which I thought I'd bring to the table for the benefit of everyone. It was from Keith, which said, Raj, my understanding of the TOLA Act implementation is that to date, there has been no use of technology capability notices, but there have been a number of uses of technology advisory notices. Is this still correct? The reason I ask is that at the time the government was putting the legislation together, we argued that industry was already willing and able to assist law enforcement wherever it was legitimate and feasible to do so. Raj, do you want to take that? And I also noticed your comments about as wise as courts are, they don't really have the necessary technical underpinning. So if you want to speak to that as well.
Yeah, so to Keith's question, I did put a slightly cheeky comment in the chat window that, I don't know, and who knows. But so on this TOLA/Aaa Bill issue, so one of the things that I think was promising was the, I always forget what the acronym is, but the Independent Security Legislation Monitor, INSLM, I think it was. So that chap did a whole review of the legislation and whatnot, and came out with a bunch of recommendations. Not all of them were perfectly aligned to how we would have liked to see it, but I think most of it were pretty well aligned in terms of at least trying to do the fixes to that. As far as I'm aware, nothing's actually come out of that recommendation that came out from the INSLM, which is a pity in itself, because at least, what we do know in Australia's case is, there's no going back, right? I mean, the circumstances under which that legislation was passed, if I recall, just prior to Christmas, the terrorists were going to blow up half of Australia. So we need to have this legislation in place, right? So obviously that's there. So what we need to try and do is, what tweaks can be made. But so far, I haven't really seen those tweaks come through. And it's been a couple of years now, frankly, in so far how that's progressed. I come back to what I said earlier about the reputational damage, right? I mean, there is a question mark about a tech company from Australia if they want to go for international markets. That trust factor is lost because you just don't know what sort of capability notices or advisors or whatever you want to call it has been served, because even the CEO of the company wouldn't know if it was served on one of the software developers, as an example, right? At least that's my understanding of how the legislation is at the moment. The second thing you mentioned, Namrata, about the courts thing, that was in response, I think, I don't know whether it was Jeremy or Mishi, one of them said something about courts. The judges and magistrates, as wise as they are, I think the problem is they're not technical experts, they're not technology experts, nor are they technology policy experts. What they do is interpret the law as stated in whatever legislation, right? And sometimes I think it's a bit of a challenge for us, when I say us, I mean that in a very wide, broad manner. It's not just the technical community, it's also people like SFLC, for instance, and Jeremy's organization and others, and Harness as well as a private sector player, that you need to be able to translate what it actually means in practice and then do it in such a way that it resonates with what the law states, right? And that becomes very difficult. A lot of these laws are so bloody old that they don't even recognize some of the things that we're using, including terminology and technology today, right? So that, I think, also becomes problematic. Now, as someone, a friend of mine from the legal profession said to me, we just need to wait a couple of generations, because then the judges and magistrates will be of this new digital generation, and they'll know exactly what the problems are. But unfortunately, that's far too long to wait, because the problems are now. And the ramifications and implications will be in the immediate future, right? So that's what I think worries me. The other thing I just want to raise for the fellow panelists and even for people who are listening into this conversation, there was mention about other countries trying to work together in many different ways, the BRICS and the Quads and whatnot. It also looks to me that a lot of them are working in the background quite significantly and bringing out joint statements and little legislative tryouts, if you will. And they seem to be fairly well organized, right? Even countries which usually you think don't necessarily agree with each other on every matter, foreign policy or otherwise, they seem to be working together on certain issues, right? And I'm not so sure the rest of us, this wider, broader community, that we have those same capabilities. We seem to come together on some parts of some things, but I don't think we are as well coordinated as we should be. I mean, even if we look at the encryption debate itself, it's been ongoing for a while. There's been a lot of organizations who have been vocal. Not all private sector is as vocal. Those who are perhaps commercially driven, maybe not. And I think Mishi mentioned something about Google early on. I'm not talking about Google, but I'm just talking very generally. But the point is, a business ultimately is there to make money. So it needs to do what will keep the shareholders happy and keep the bottom line well and good. But then where does that leave the rest of us? Because, once you have the biggest, most powerful economies and countries of the world working together on certain things, it becomes very difficult to try and go up against that, right? So I'd be keen to hear what people's thoughts are on that as well, because I see that as a growing problem. And if we are not able to nip it in the bud, I feel it'll become an avalanche that we will not be able to run away from. So I'll leave it at that, and perhaps some others have better thoughts than I have on this. Thanks, Namrata.
Thank you, Raj. I think Keith may want to step in with his comments. May I invite you to share the mic, please?
Yeah, sure. I was really just trying to make the point to Raj that while I was part of the efforts in Australia to try and talk the Australian government out of going down the path of implementing the TOLA legislation, I don't personally believe that the most severe aspect of that legislation, the capability notices, are going to be used very much, if at all, for the very simple reason that it's actually going to be very difficult to use them, and it may not be practical, and it may ultimately fail. And I think that the law enforcement and intelligence agencies have enough understanding of the technology to realize that. So my personal view is that that background threat will remain a background threat. There's no shortage of collaboration with law enforcement in Australia by communications companies, RSPs and ISPs. So I think that the legislation was enacted as much for political purposes as for any other reason. I could well be wrong, but at this point in time, I'm not really convinced that the most onerous parts of that legislation will in practice be used in Australia. That doesn't mean I support them. I think they should be rescinded. But as Raj pointed out, I think that's extremely unlikely to happen. We're just going to have to live with this legislation now. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Keith. And anybody else, any of the participants, if you have comments or questions, please let us know. Raise your hand or share them in the chat. Hannah, I wanted to quickly share with you a question that I think a topic that has come up in this conversation about the private sector, right? What are your thoughts on what is the kind of pressure that the private sector faces from the government and also from developments in the private sector when other companies choose voluntarily to implement measures that undermine or circumvent end-to-end encryption, the most recent example being Apple? What kind of pressure does that put on other companies in the private sector? And the second question is, do you have any thoughts on how the private sector can come together, a wider range of companies like we've been discussing, to advocate against proposals that would undermine encryption?
Yeah, sure. The recent example with Apple is that they wanted to scan pictures for CSAM. The problem here is because Apple before marketed itself as one of the most privacy protecting companies in the world, it gives an impression that it is possible to offer privacy and undermine it at the same time. But of course, this is not possible. But because of this impression, the pressure from politicians, from governments rises because they say, hey, if Apple can do it, why can't you do it as well? But we at Tutanota, we use end-to-end encryption. And that's it. It's open source. Everyone can check it. We can't just put in a backdoor here. We also would not, because it undermines our service. It undermines the point of being here. And even if you say that companies will fall, it always depends on the company. Because obviously a large company like Google, who has a lot of products, say, okay, I'd better go along with what the government says than lose the market. But the real privacy-centered companies like Tutanota, we do what we do because we are passionate about privacy. We would not undermine this. Instead, we fight. We have joined forces with other companies. We write open letters. We engage in the political discussions, like the discussion here, discussions directly with politicians in our countries. But what we need is the general public to understand the issue as well. We feel a bit like we are the lone fighters. Of course, we have our community. I don't know how many there are in India, but I would say in Germany it's maybe 10. If we are really optimistic, maybe 20% of the population who stands behind our goals and shares them. And the majority is just ignorant to the issue. And that's what we have to achieve, is to make the public understand why this is so important, because otherwise the politicians will just listen to the law enforcement people who of course want to break encryption because it makes the job for them easier. But in this process, we must, I don't know how to put it, but we must understand, we must make the public understand how important that is for society, as I mentioned before, the right to privacy. And fight together, because we are all in this, and once encryption falls, it will be much more difficult to get it back than to defend it now.
Sorry, I just realized I was on mute. Thank you so much, Hannah. There's a question from Anju. Any of the panelists can take it. Can encryption work against the insider threats? In the case of Edward Snowden, encrypting the data didn't work. Do any of the panelists or any of the participants would like to engage with this question? Jeremy, do you want to take a stab at that, since we haven't heard from you?
I mean, I guess it does ignore a lot of the focusing on encrypting data. Yeah, it does ignore sort of insider threats as it's been presented in the question, meaning other ways that confidentiality can be breached using clear text at either end of the conversation. So encryption doesn't protect against all of those. all of those threats. And so seizing control of a device, for example, being able to read the characters that are being typed on the screen, or being able to take screenshots of it, that is a way of circumventing encryption. So I don't think anyone here, though, is saying that encryption is a solution to that kind of targeted surveillance. And that's what we're talking about in the Edward Snowden case. For 99% of us, we're not ever going to be the subject of targeted surveillance. So I feel like encryption does, even though it doesn't offer a complete solution to that level of privacy, I don't think that that's the use case for most people. So it doesn't concern me too much that we're not all able to use sort of Snowden level of secure communications.
Thanks so much, Jeremy. A quick follow-up while you have the mic. Since a lot of the debate does focus on child sexual abuse material, child safety, what would your response to claims that content on end-to-end encrypted platforms has to be moderated to protect children be? What would your response to such arguments look like?
Well, you can't pick and choose what sort of content you want to be able to view over encrypted services. You can't say, well, we just want to be able to intercept child abuse material, because even there's new child abuse material being generated all of the time, including live streaming. So I think we really need to look at other approaches to this problem, intervening before people offended to begin with. There's a great unmet need for mental health services, for support, for education. And so these are some of the other approaches that we can take to the problem, rather than trying to circumvent secure communications. And we've overinvested as a society in surveillance and censorship, and really underinvested in this wide array of prevention interventions. And I think it's time for that to change.
Thanks so much, Jeremy. Dildar, you've raised your hand. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, Namrata ma'am, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, and Namrata is just fine. Thanks.
Yeah. It's all about, just like Mishi said, it's we are talking about the security versus privacy. So we should agree with that the government should make the policies which is based on the ethics of the people, which means the security of the data and encryption or decryption. It's all about the ethics of the people, that how people thinks about that. It's a security means everyone should secure their data, and they also wants their privacy also. So the government should make much strong agencies that work with the companies who work use for the data, which means Facebook, WhatsApp, and all social media. We are talking about the data security, which means there is a worst case that just like any area, there is a precedent rule has been implemented. And normal days, the business is going on within the peoples and companies. So in the whole area, which the government policies should make a best rules and regulations that secure as well as save the data. It's not I'm agree with that the data should be encrypted, but so for example, any dark web user are using for the threatening to someone. So in that cases, the government has the authority to trace that people. So that's all about I want to say. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dildar. We have a question from Jyoti Pandey. When talking about encryption, we focus on high-end devices, but is the risk more for low-end phones, devices that will be used far more readily in Asia? And there's a link to a research paper that I encourage everyone to read. But are there any comments on this, or did anybody want to share any thoughts on the different threats on the different kinds of devices when we talk about encryption? Okay,
so
great. Raj, go ahead.
Yeah, I can make a very quick comment. Not necessarily specifically for the question that Jyoti asked, but more generally speaking, one of the other concerns I have is if you look at the huge, broad spectrum of devices that we use, be they Android or Microsoft or iOS or whatever it may be, and the point is actually correct. It's not necessarily the new high-end devices. I'm also worried about the older devices people use, right? A lot of people don't upgrade their phones. They don't upgrade their software. And obviously those have vulnerabilities, but as well, they don't necessarily have the capabilities to meet modern day encryption needs. So there is a gap there as well, I think, that needs to be bridged. So, there's multiple issues that we need to work on. And sometimes I do wonder, where do we start and who does what? Because that's the other thing that seems to be a bit of a gap, in my opinion.
Thanks, Raj. Mishi, go ahead.
So that's actually a great question. That also tells you how encryption is not for the little people, but only for the rich. Because even if you see, wow, that is quite a bell. Good job, Rajneesh. Sorry. So if you see India's IT rules also, in the new rules, there lies a concealed chilling policy declaration that strong privacy is to be put beyond the reach of common people, all of whose communications are supposed to be seen by the governments of the future all the time. Why? Because they do mandate a certain number. If you have more than 5 million users, which means the common people, but everyone else can get their own smaller apps and start working and buy those devices with the privacy respecting applications without thinking about any of these burdensome rules, etc. I will also say that there is a major concern about a major discussion about centralized systems for secure communications. We do think about Signal and WhatsApp as great things, but they're still centralized systems which offer great advantages in flexibility and technical resources, but they also have the disadvantage of being large enough to be reached by the systems of discriminatory regulation which the government proposes. So and that's why we need a little more of decentralized solutions as well. But again, by trying to control the encryption for the masses, I think the governments also don't realize they're going to cause people to take further steps to protect their privacy in ways that will even be harder for the government to invade for legitimate reasons also. But my strong beliefs is that those legitimate reasons actually don't exist right now. I think a lot of it is just used as a cover to get other things going. Because if there was an actual serious interest in addressing these issues, then we would have the governments hiring experts to talk about metadata analysis, to have other techniques like message ranking or something else, and not say just go find a magical solution. I don't see the signs of actual engagement here. To Jyoti's question, it is quite true that we are more and more seeing that people who can pay are going to have better privacy, and people who are at the mercy of either the large companies or the government for various things are going to be deprived of an important right in exchange of some small subsidy here or there.
Thanks so much, Mishi. Very quickly, there was a comment from Bisharad about end-to-end encryption on WhatsApp and whether they in fact have it. Quickly, I think the link that you're referring to talks about the content of a message becoming accessible to WhatsApp after the recipient has reported it, which means that when you're reporting it, you're typically sharing the key to that content, and only after that can WhatsApp see it. Before that, all the content is end-to-end encrypted, but I'm happy to be corrected, but I hope that answers your question. With that, we have a minute and a half. So I'm just going to very quickly invite Jeremy and Hannah to, since we've heard recently from Mishi and Raj, to make some quick closing remarks. I apologize for giving you such little time for the closing remarks.
I'm going to cede my time. I don't have anything further to say. Thank you, though.
Yeah, I just wanted to say again, thank you very much for having me here and for raising the importance of encryption. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so very much, everyone. I had such a great time. I've learned a lot. I have about 8 pages worth of notes to pour over. So thank you so much for being here. I will share the links on the chat, some of the links that were shared with us about Tuternota and some larger bios. I encourage you to also visit APrIGF's website and the handle on Twitter. There's a lot of interesting information there that might be useful. Thank you so much for joining today. A big thank you to the panelists that this has been illuminating. Thank you so much. In the remaining 30 seconds, I will quickly share the links.
Just a note, the showcase is just about to start, so please hop over through the link to the showcase. And
we're at time. Thank you. Have a great rest of the day, rest of the night, and keep encryption safe. Bye, everyone.